Mr. Trump sees allies as a burden and not as an asset. I'm not sure that Mr. Trump has some grand strategy here. I think this is somebody who operates as much on gut instinct and political whim. Trump and the inner circle, what they're prepared to do is say, let's go back to a sphere of influence world where China has East Asia, Russia has the post-Soviet space, and even maybe part of Europe, and the United States has North America and maybe part of South America. If I were in a NATO European country, I would be working to try to keep the United States and keep the Trump administration engaged.
Word inside Tomasz Waleński. Welcome, everyone. Our guest today is going to be Stephen Pifer, former U.S. diplomat and former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Welcome, Stephen. I would like to start. I saw on your Twitter account recently that you agreed to an article which was saying that the American age is over. Are you still agreeing to it?
Well, actually, what I said is
you're afraid?
I'm afraid the article is correct. I hope it is not.
Of course, yes. So could you tell us a little bit more about it?
Well, it's what I define as the American age is I think you've seen the United States after World War II develop institutions, develop relationships, develop alliances that I think were obviously good and in America's interest. And I'm not saying the United States did not make mistakes. We made some horrible mistakes. But I think actually, we're also good in general for the world. I mean, for example, under the economic and trade rules that the United States worked out, China lifted 500 million people out of poverty. And what I worry about now is I think that the current administration, the Trump administration, unfortunately has adopted policies which put those relationships in danger. So you see it in, I think, the discounting of alliances, the fact that we're, in an argument with Denmark over Greenland. We've adopted, I think, almost a hostile stance towards Canada and this absolutely silly talk about making Canada the 51st state. Whereas we're not challenging some of our adversaries, such as Russia, and then just the economic nonsense of the past week with the application of tariffs. And let me say, I'm not opposed to all tariffs, but I think the kind of tariffs that were launched by President Trump, I think on a whim a week ago, and then yesterday were walked back, except for China. We've created a lot of chaos, and we've done some things that are going to undercut both American hard and American soft power. That's unfortunate for the United States.
It's leading me to next question. You mentioned, for example, Greenland. Danish experts are saying that the 75 years of Western security system is now over. Would you agree with this? It means, of course, yes, President Trump's policy on allies, and of course, it's related to NATO issue.
Yeah. Well, let me say this. I think Mr. Trump is correct that allies in Europe need to do more for their own defense.
Yeah.
And sometimes we say,
no doubt.
Poland's already at 4.5% of gross domestic
almost
product,
5%,
which is well ahead of what the United States is doing. And I think other countries now are coming around, and there seems to be a growing recognition in Europe that at least 3 to 3.5% of gross domestic product.
Yep.
So I think that's been successful. Although I think it could have been done in a different way. What I worry about, though, is that Mr. Trump sees allies as a burden and not as an asset. And it seems to me that having alliance relationships have several advantages. One, forward basing. I mean, if you look at the last 20 years, a lot of the American military operations on the ground in Europe have been supporting American military operations in places like the Middle East or Afghanistan.
Yes.
Two, they provide,
Denmark, for example.
Sometimes when we go to war with allies. I mean, Poland, had the third largest contingent in Iraq in 2003. Now, I personally think 2003 that war was a mistake, but we had allies with us. We had the British, we had the Poles, we had the Australians,
Yes.
we had countries on the ground in Afghanistan. And this is a point that gets lost in the United States, and I don't think Mr. Trump understands this. Over 20 years, we lost 2,400 Americans, but 1,000 NATO troops died. And they were only there because they were allies. So allies sometimes, often go to war with us. And the third thing is allies, even if they don't go to war, sometimes will be politically supportive. And so if you have a military action that's conducted with a broad range of support, it is seen internationally as more legitimate than if it's just the United States going off on their own as the traditional American cowboy. I don't think Mr. Trump gets that. I worry that, again, he looks at alliances mainly as a burden. I hope at the end of the day, wiser heads will counsel him and the United States will maintain the now 76-year-old relationship we have with NATO, because I think that advances and contributes to American security. But I can also understand if there's now a conversation in Europe that says, what do we Europeans do if the American security commitment goes away?
Exactly. That's the point, that it's right ongoing in Europe. For example, the Danish experts are talking about looking for a second way for their country, and they're not the only country which is looking for a second way in Europe. So how should it look like? Is NATO still a reliable alliance, or are we facing bigger outcomes in the future?
Yeah, I think that's the big unknown. If I were in a NATO European country, I would be working to try to keep the United States and keep the Trump administration engaged. I do believe that people like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State,
Yes,
the National Security Advisor Waltz, I think they understand and appreciate the value of NATO. So try to keep the United States engaged. But I think it's a smart thing to have a plan B. I mean, how would Europe develop if, in fact, it became clear that the President Trump was not prepared to commit American force to Europe's defense?
So should European countries, as of, for example, the ones that are in the European Union, make some sort of contribution for maybe an European Union alliance, which will be included by those countries?
Yeah.
But there is a question: if you contribute your resources to a second alliance, then you can't contribute them to NATO. So it's a difficult.
There was a discussion 30 years ago that took place between NATO and the European Union, which I'm not sure ever got resolved with a firm answer, which was, what if the European Union wanted to take a military action that was not necessarily in defense of NATO? So it was not an Article 5 contingency. But if the European Union wanted to act militarily and the United States said, we're going to get past on this one. And the suggestion that seemed more persuasive to me was, rather than the European Union developing its own command structure, could you develop a structure within NATO that would also have the capacity, though, to sort of, if the United States decided not to participate, Europe could then act. So this is one, I think, for people smarter than me. If there's going to be a plan B looking at a possible future in which NATO has to have a security and defense identity separate from the United States, does that go better in the European Union, or does that go better in a Europeanized version of NATO? I don't feel competent enough to answer that.
All right. One part of NATO, American involvement in NATO, is nuclear deterrence, which is an important one. It is also a question in Europe right now. What about that? And the French are stepping up. Should Europe also, in your opinion, do something with it, or make some sorts of own deterrence possibilities?
Well, again, I kind of have a two-sided answer. On the one side, I think it's important that Europe not do anything that leads the United States, that leads the Trump administration to say, okay, we're done here. So
Okay.
again, you want to try to keep America engaged, and that
Yes.
includes the American nuclear umbrella. But I think also quietly there ought to be some thinking: what happens if that umbrella goes away? Could you use a combination of French and British forces, which in numbers and in variety they will not be as large or as varied as American nuclear forces?
No.
But between those two countries, you're still talking about 400 or 500 nuclear weapons. That is not an insignificant force.
No.
But then how would that work in terms of extending some kind of deterrent to the rest of Europe? I think that would be a fairly involved conversation, but you want to have it in a way that doesn't somehow have the unfortunate side effect of sort of pushing the United States away.
Of course. You mentioned earlier. You mentioned earlier that an alliance goes both ways. So America was joined by European countries in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. And if there will be no more alliances or countries which will join the United States in whatever it takes in terms of China. You also mentioned it in your social medias that if you're alone, it's going to be tougher for you.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent, first of all, I'm not sure that Mr. Trump has some grand strategy here. I think this is somebody who operates as much on gut instinct and political whim as he does anything else. But to the extent that there's been an explanation of a strategy here, and I think Secretary Rubio has alluded to it, it's the suggestion that if the United States kind of throws Ukraine under the bus, takes a step back away from Europe, that those steps will be approved by Moscow, and then somehow we can peel Putin away from President Xi of China. And again, a couple of times, I think Secretary Rubio has alluded to something like this. If that is the strategy, it suggests to me that there's a fundamental misunderstanding at the top level of the U.S. government about the relationship between Russia and China and Putin and Xi. Putin is not going to, Putin and Xi have this relationship over 40 meetings. It goes back years. They talk about a partnership without limits, although it does have some limits. But Russia is now dependent on China. Putin is not going to jettison Xi, place a bet on Donald Trump, who is unpredictable, and despite what he may be thinking, is not going to be president in 4 years' time. That's not the bet Putin's going to make. And so I fear if we follow this strategy, if that is the strategy, 2 or 3 years down the road, the United States will have to deal with Russia and with China. And when we turn to Europe and say, we'd like some help to do, some economic pressure on China, Europe's going to say, hey, you left us on our own to deal with Russia. Why should we help with China? And it seems to me the Chinese already recognize this. I think that you've seen some indications in the last 4 to 5 weeks that China is reaching out to engage Europe and the European Union more closely. So if that's the strategy that the administration is using as its main guidance for foreign policy, it's badly flawed in its assumptions. And at the end of the day, it will need the United States down the road with fewer allies and friends to deal with challenges like China.
So is China trying to fill the void after the U.S. is somehow leaving Europe? So is President Xi trying to fill the gap, actually?
I think the Chinese were concerned and have been concerned in the last couple of years that Europe, like the United States, has become alarmed by the growing dependence on China on certain goods. But I think you've now seen an effort by the Chinese to reach out to Europe. And I think the European Union, there was a conversation I think I saw last week where a senior European Union official said, look, if these are the kind of tariffs we're going to face with America, we're going to have to look elsewhere to strengthen our trade relationships. China, I think, will be only too happy to take advantage of that.
Of course, but is it the main goal of the Mr. Trump administration to somehow split the alliance between President Putin and President Xi?
Again, to the extent that there is a strategy,
if there is a strategy,
if there is a strategy, that's the only thing I can think of. Well, there's one other alternative, which is that Trump and the inner circle, what they're prepared to do is say, let's go back to a sphere of influence world where China has East Asia, Russia has the post-Soviet space, and even maybe part of Europe, and the United States has North America and maybe part of South America. Again, I think that from the perspective of American nationalists will not be a happy world, because the Russians and the Chinese will be working together. We're going to be the odd man out. And I think we also are going to be the Russians and the Chinese will be better imperialists in their spheres of influence than we will.
They will be definitely. But as you are looking, for example, on the movement of U.S. Army right now in Europe, this week there was an announcement made by U.S. Army for U.S. Command for Europe and Africa to leave the base in Jesionka in Poland, which is the most important base to supply Ukraine. General Donahue said in the statement that it's a part of saving American taxpayers' money. And obviously, it's also combined with the strategy to turn to the Eastern Indo-Pacific region. So it looks like a part of a strategy. So if there is a strategy, it's ongoing, isn't it?
Although I thought I saw that the American troops were going to relocate from that base, though, to another base inside Poland. So,
yes.
So again, the question to my mind is going to be: does the United States at some point draw down forces in Europe?
There is also reports made by CNBC, I guess, or
that it may happen. But I guess the question would be, to my mind, is it done in consultation with Europe, and what number? You could argue that there could be some elements of American force that might be drawn down. So until we see exactly what's being discussed, I'm not sure that you can read too much into this.
All right. And coming down to Ukraine, you were part of negotiation team by the Budapest Memorandum. So do you see any similarities or differences between those negotiations which you were part of and the negotiations right now which are ongoing between the United States and Russia?
Yeah. Well, the Budapest Memorandum, and actually its antecedent was the January 1994 trilateral statement. That really set out the terms for the elimination of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And actually, the trilateral statement pretty much had the text of the Budapest Memorandum saying, these are the security assurances that Ukraine gets once it accedes to the non-proliferation treaties of non-nuclear weapon states. It's a very different world. I mean,
it is.
A mistake was made, I think, in 1993-94, and it was a mistake both by us in Washington, but also by our Ukrainian counterparts. We simply did not foresee what Vladimir Putin did in 2014 with regards to Crimea, or in 2022 with the all-out invasion. I mean,
nobody has a crystal ball.
So no one has. Had the Ukrainians, though, thought that was a real possibility, history would have been very different. So I can understand now for the Ukrainians, they want something much more tangible in terms of a security guarantee. I personally now am persuaded that the best security guarantee would be to bring Ukraine into NATO. I mean, and that from an American point of view, for more than 7 decades, the United States has defined as a vital national interest a stable and secure Europe. I don't think you get a stable and secure Europe unless there's a stable and secure Ukraine. And the best way to do that is to bring it into NATO. Now, how you do that is hard. I don't think that happens while Ukraine is at war. You have to have some kind
It's
of a
very
settlement.
unlikely.
Maybe a second security model is one that now seems to be discussed by the British and the French, is this idea of a reassurance force that is
Yes.
Western boots on the ground. That's an interesting idea to me, but I think a crucial question is going to be is there some kind of a link back to the United States, both a technical link in terms of some capabilities that the United States might provide, like intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance, but also is there some political commitment from the United States to support that force? And as far as I know, that's not there yet. And then
All
the
right.
third model would be what people call the porcupine model, which is the West basically tells Ukraine, we're not committing any military force on our part to your defense. But here, we're going to shovel in so much military equipment. We're going to make the Ukrainian military, 800, 900,000 armed to the teeth so that the Russians never consider this again. But I think you've got to have one of those models at the end of the day if you're going to have the Ukrainians prepared to accept a settlement, because I think there's a very legitimate fear on the part of the Ukrainians that if they make some settlement now, which perhaps does not allow them to recover all of their territory, how do they know that in 3 years after rebuilding the army, Putin doesn't launch round two? And I think the United States and the West should be negotiating or helping Ukraine negotiate for an outcome that allows them to then be secure that they don't have to face the prospect of another Russian invasion 3, 4, 5 years down the road.
And should the European partners and Ukraine as well join the table between United States and Russia? Because, as you said, like involvement of boots on the ground from the French and the Brits, they should have a place at the table.
Yeah. Vladimir Putin wants to make this a U.S.-Russian negotiation over the heads of Europe and over the heads of Ukraine.
Yes.
If the Trump administration falls into that trap, it will fail. I mean, the Ukrainians have been pretty clear. They're not going to negotiate or accept a deal that's not negotiated with them not at the table. And my argument for the Europeans being at the table, or at least closely wired in, is because the Trump administration wants Europe to do a lot. I mean, the Trump administration seems to view Europe as the primary body to implement support for Ukraine under the terms of a settlement. Well, in that case, Europe either has to be at the table or has to be so closely consulted that it feels like it's at the table. And I worry that based on what we've seen in the past 2 months, I'm not sure that Mr. Trump understands that.
You said that it's a trap made by Vladimir Putin, so it would be inconvenient for him that the Europeans will join the table.
Well, I think it's
understanding it correct.
Yeah, but I think Vladimir Putin has a belief, and I think he's probably correct in this. By the report of many people who work for him, Donald Trump doesn't like to prepare for meetings. He doesn't like to get briefings or read complicated papers or study the details. Vladimir Putin studies the details. He studies the minutia. And I think Putin calculates that, from Putin's point of view, the ideal with negotiation would be, Donald, let's get rid of all the unnecessary help. You and I go in the room and we'll solve the deal. And what's going to happen? Putin will manipulate Trump. He will spin things. And unfortunately, because Trump didn't take the briefings, Trump at the end of the day will not understand what he's giving away. That's my worry. And I think that's exactly what Putin would like to do. And that's why at the end of the day, I argue you've got to, this negotiation ultimately is going to have Ukrainians talking to Russians. The Americans can be there. The Europeans should be there. But, at the end of the day, Trump and Putin can negotiate a settlement. It's always going to be in Ukraine's power to say no. And I fear if you had just a bilateral conversation, a Trump-Putin negotiation, you would get a bad settlement and the Ukrainians would walk away from it.
Yeah, but on the one hand, there are still negotiations ongoing, not only between President Trump and Putin by themselves, but also within the teams. So, I mean, for example, envoy Mr. Witkoff, is he competent enough to conclude such a negotiations? We saw different statements, I would say. One of them is with the crying President Putin to the painting of President Trump. What do you think actually about the team
I
itself?
am afraid to say that I have very little confidence in Mr. Witkoff as a negotiator with the Russians. Based on what he has said publicly, he seems to take a lot of what the Russians say at face value. I mean, the idea that the Russians shot down 7 of their own drones that were attacking Ukraine is just ludicrous. When he says that, talks about, well, there are a lot of Russian speakers in occupied parts of Ukraine that are occupied by the Russians. Well, yes, but what it suggests to me is he doesn't understand there are a lot of Ukrainians, a lot of ethnic Ukrainians who use Russian as their first language.
Yes.
Vladimir Zelensky's first language was Russian. Then he later learned Ukrainian. So the fact that there are Russian speakers in places like Donbass, Zaporizhzhia, so on, that's meaningless. I mean, it's like, yeah, it just, but again, he seemed to think that that was an important point that should be considered in the settlement. He talks about referenda. The referenda in Crimea, the referenda that were conducted in September of 2022 in the Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, they were bogus. They were totally bogus. And you should not give an ounce of credibility to them. But he seems to think they were important. That worries me.
And that's why the Russians wanted to exclude General Keith Kellogg from the negotiations. He seems to be more aware of the situation.
Yeah, and it's a mistake to let the other side pick your negotiating team for you.
Of course, because you're picking the players who do you like to play. So
yeah,
easy as that.
So I do worry about that. I hope that Secretary Rubio, I think Secretary Rubio seems to be a bit smarter on these questions, but we'll see.
And do you expect a ceasefire? We are like right now 4 weeks after the supposed ceasefire, and there is not much difference in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So do you expect
no
proper ceasefire or just
no? I mean, the Trump administration, well, Secretary Rubio and National Security Advisor Waltz, I guess actually more than 4 weeks ago, persuaded Ukraine to accept a full 30-day ceasefire.
Yes.
Ukraine said yes, even though I think that there was some reluctance in Kyiv on that, but they said yes. That was the American demand. It's now clear that the Russians are diddling, they're dithering, they're placing conditions. The Russians have, in effect, rejected a full ceasefire.
Yep.
And I guess Mr. Trump said 10 days ago he was getting very angry. Well, I don't think Putin cares, because he has not yet taken a single step to punish Russia for not accepting the ceasefire that he put forward. And he has lots of leverage, which he hasn't used. But instead, you have negotiations going on today on things like, facilitating the work of embassies and such. But if you're Putin, you're saying, look, for 2 months now, what I've received from the Americans have been concessions. They're leaning towards the Russian position on things like Ukraine can't get its territory back, Ukraine can't join NATO. Trump has agreed to meet with Putin, so breaking the Western boycott that goes back 3 years on meetings with Putin. He's getting concession after concession. And as far as I can tell, the United States hasn't received anything in return. That's not the way to negotiate with Putin in the Kremlin. You're only encouraging him to sit back and wait for more concessions. You're not getting him to move, and Putin hasn't moved. It's a mistaken policy, and at the end of the day, I think it will end up producing little benefit to the United States unless there's a major change in course by Mr. Trump.
As you said, the statement that President Trump is angry of Russia actions was made 10 days ago or so. But since then, he announced the tariffs, which Russia wasn't included. Should we expect some sort of I don't know, steps? Do you expect some steps still?
Yeah, I mean, there are steps that Mr. Trump could take. He could move to tighten Western sanctions, close down some of the loopholes. He could ask the G7 to move to seize the $300 billion in Russian frozen central bank assets. He could ask Congress for another $40 billion for military assistance. He could do things that would put real pressure. And I'm disappointed that he's taken none of those steps. Those steps would, I think, basically confront Putin with the fact that if Putin continues the war, the military and economic costs for him are only going to increase. He hasn't done that. So, maybe at some point, Trump's a volatile, unpredictable person. At some point, does he really get mad at Putin? And maybe he does. Then he says, okay, we're going to do this, 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 and this. And that might change the perspective in Moscow and might change the attitude in Moscow. But from what I've seen in his first 2.5 months, Trump has done nothing to change Putin's attitude towards either Ukraine or more broadly towards the United States.
But there is a thing that Mr. Trump have actually changed, and would you agree with this, that after the meeting in the Oval Office with President Zelensky, Europe has some sort of waken up? So Europe, could it be that the meeting, which we all saw how it went, could be at the end of the day positive for Ukraine and for Europe as well?
Yeah. Well, I go back and I look at that meeting, which I think was, certainly in the 45 or 50 years I followed foreign policy, I've never seen a foreign leader treated so rudely in the White House, particularly the leader who was a partner of America. And I watched the video a number of times. I mean, Vice President Vance clearly jumped in to blow up that meeting. What I don't know did Vance do that by pre-agreement with the president? Or did Vance just jump in and think that I can goad the president into, getting mad? Either way, I mean, it had some unintended consequences. Actually, Zelensky's popularity went up significantly.
Yes.
In Ukraine, because at the end of the day, he stood his ground, and properly so. I think it was a message I think it was a shock to the Europeans, and it seems, from what I can, again, watching from the outside, it seems to have led to a more serious conversation among Europeans on, what's the plan B? If this is how Trump acts towards Ukraine, which suggests that Trump may not be prepared to continue American support as it's been going the last 3 years for Ukraine. But also, then what does it mean if then that suggests that Mr. Trump might not be committed to European security? So I think it has started that conversation in Europe. And while I wish we were not at the point where that had to take place, that conversation, I think it's smart for Europeans to be having that discussion.
All right. That's it, actually.
Okay.
That was my final question. So thank you very much for your assessments.